Don't take it from me! Don't touch him!
"Throw that porter out, now," the head of security shouted, as two guards grabbed the young man's arms. Guests laughed while dozens of executives watched. The porter didn't argue. He simply tightened his grip on a worn leather envelope and kept looking toward the stage as if he was waiting for someone. Then the impossible happened. Billionaire chairman Richard Sterling slowly rose to his feet. The laughter died instantly. "Don't touch him," he said. "He's the reason every director was told to attend today." Nobody understood. Who was this porter? What was inside the envelope? Why had someone instructed him to wait until every board member was present? Why did the chairman recognize him the moment he saw him? And what secret was so powerful that it stopped the company's biggest meeting before it had even begun? The guards tightened their grip on the porter. "Sir, don't make this harder than it has to be," one of them warned. The young man remained calm. His faded uniform was spotless, but it was obvious he didn't belong among the tuxedos and designer gowns surrounding him. Guests pulled out their phones. "He's probably trying to scam the chairman. Someone should have stopped him at the entrance. He must be desperate." Each comment landed in the room like another public insult. The porter never answered. Instead, he held the worn leather envelope a little closer to his chest. The head of security reached for it. "Give me that." "No," the porter replied quietly. "This belongs to Chairman Sterling." The crowd laughed. "As if the chairman knows you. You're a porter. You carry luggage, not confidential documents." The security chief snatched the envelope anyway. Before he could tear it open, a deep voice echoed across the ballroom. "Put it back." Every head turned. Chairman Richard Sterling was already walking toward them. Not running. Not shouting. Just walking with a calm expression that somehow frightened everyone more. The board members exchanged nervous glances. Even the hotel's general manager looked confused. Richard stopped only a few feet away. His eyes never left the envelope. "Who gave you permission to touch something addressed to me?" he asked. The security chief swallowed hard. "Sir," he refused to identify himself. "I didn't ask that." A heavy silence followed. "I asked who gave you permission." Nobody spoke. Richard gently took the envelope from the guard's trembling hands. He brushed the dust from its surface as though it were priceless. Then his expression changed. He recognized the old wax seal. His fingers froze. His breathing slowed. One elderly board member suddenly stood up. "That seal," he whispered. "It can't be." The chairman looked directly at the porter for the first time. "What is your name?" "Ethan Brooks, sir." The chairman nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer for years. "And who sent you here, Ethan?" The young porter hesitated. The ballroom became so quiet that the sound of a champagne glass being set down echoed across the room. Finally, Ethan spoke. "A man asked me to wait until today's shareholders' banquet. He said I should hand this envelope to you, only after everyone important was in the same room." A ripple of confusion swept through the guests. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, they were filled with emotion. Then he said something that made every executive in the ballroom forget how to breathe. "If that message says what I think it says, everything this company believes about its own history is about to change." Nobody moved. The chairman stared at the envelope as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. "What happened to the man who gave this to you?" Richard asked quietly. Ethan lowered his eyes. "He passed away 3 days ago." The room fell silent. "What was his name?" "Daniel Brooks." Richard's face lost all color. One elderly director suddenly whispered, "After 40 years, he actually kept his promise." A new question filled the ballroom. "What promise?" Richard carefully broke the wax seal. A faded photograph slipped onto the floor. He picked it up before anyone else could. His hands began to shake. It showed two young men standing beside a tiny warehouse. One was Richard, the other was Daniel. "We built this company together." Gasps echoed through the ballroom. A board director immediately objected. "That's impossible. The official history says you founded Sterling Global alone." Richard looked at him. "That's the version someone wanted you to believe." The room grew uneasy. If the company's history was a lie, what else had been hidden? Ethan stared at the photograph. His grandfather had never mentioned any of this. To Ethan, Daniel Brooks had simply been an old mechanic, a quiet man who repaired broken engines, who lived in a modest house, who never spoke about money, never spoke about success, never spoke about Richard Sterling, except once. 3 days before he died, Daniel had called Ethan to his bedside. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. He handed Ethan the leather envelope. No matter what happens, don't open it. Take it to Richard Sterling. Then Daniel grabbed Ethan's wrist. His expression suddenly changed. If anyone tries to take it from you, let them. Ethan frowned. You want me to let them steal it? Daniel smiled. They won't be stealing it. They'll be exposing themselves. That sentence had haunted Ethan ever since. Who was Daniel expecting? And how could he know someone would try to seize the envelope? Back in the ballroom, Richard folded the letter with great care. He knew the guilty person would reveal himself. An executive stood abruptly. This meeting has gone far enough. Richard slowly turned toward him. No. His voice was calm. It's finally beginning. Then he looked at Ethan. Your grandfather didn't send you here because of this letter. He sent you here to expose the one person who believed Daniel's secret died with him. The words hit the ballroom like thunder. Someone in this room betrayed both of us. No one spoke. Several executives looked at each other. Others suddenly found the floor more interesting than the chairman's face. Ethan stood quietly beside the security guards, still unsure why he was at the center of a story that had begun decades before he was born. Richard folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket. Lock the doors. The order was calm. It was also absolute. The hotel staff hesitated. Then every exit to the ballroom was quietly secured. A ripple of panic spread through the guests. Chairman, what is this? We have flights to catch. This is highly inappropriate. Richard ignored every complaint. For 40 years, he said, I believed my closest friend abandoned this company after taking a large amount of money. Several board members nodded. That was the story everyone knew. Richard slowly shook his head. The letter tells a different story. Silence returned. It says Daniel never stole a single dollar. Gasps echoed across the room. He was framed. An elderly director suddenly stood up. That letter proves nothing. It proves enough, Richard answered. It contains details only Daniel and I could have known. The director forced a smile. Memories can be invented. Richard looked directly into his eyes. So can company records. The room exploded with whispers. Ethan watched the older man's confidence begin to crack. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. Richard continued. Daniel wrote that the person responsible would probably still be sitting in this room today. Every executive instinctively glanced around the ballroom. Nobody wanted to be the first person anyone suspected. Then Ethan remembered something. Chairman, Richard turned. My grandfather gave me something else. The room froze again. You didn't mention that. I didn't know it mattered. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. Security immediately stepped forward. Richard raised one hand. Let him continue. Ethan carefully removed a small brass key. It was old. Its edges were worn smooth from age. Attached to it was a faded paper tag with 3 handwritten words. Vault 17B. Richard's eyes widened. No. One elderly shareholder nearly dropped his glass. It still exists? Richard took one slow step toward Ethan. Where did he keep this? In an old toolbox. He told me never to lose it. The chairman closed his hand around the key. His breathing became uneven. I searched for this key for 28 years. Every person in the ballroom stared at the tiny piece of brass as though it were made of gold. One nervous executive suddenly reached for his phone beneath the table, before he could send a message. Richard noticed. Mr. Collins. The executive froze. Who are you trying to warn? The man's face turned pale. He slowly lowered the phone, but everyone had already seen his fear. Every eye turned to Executive Vice President Harold Collins. His phone was still in his hand. I wasn't warning anyone, he stammered. I was canceling another meeting. No one believed him. Richard extended his hand. The phone. Collins hesitated. I said, the phone. With trembling fingers, Collins handed it over. Richard glanced at the screen. The message had never been sent. It read, "Destroy everything in Vault 17B immediately." A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. Richard slowly looked up. So there is something worth destroying. Collins' face drained of color. "You don't understand." "Then help us understand," Richard replied. The room erupted with whispers. Guests who had laughed at Ethan minutes earlier were now staring at him with entirely different eyes. The hotel manager quietly walked over to Ethan. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan looked surprised. "I'm deeply sorry for how you were treated." The head of security lowered his head. "So am I." Ethan simply nodded. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted answers. An elderly woman near the front suddenly stood. She had served on the company's advisory board for over 30 years. "I remember Daniel," she said softly. "He was brilliant. He treated everyone with respect." Her voice trembled. "When he disappeared, none of it made sense." Another shareholder stood. "I questioned the investigation back then, but every document pointed to Daniel." Richard nodded. "Exactly. Someone didn't just betray my friend. They rewrote history." A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. Richard turned toward Collins again. "Who helped you?" Collins shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard didn't argue. Instead, he held up the faded photograph from the envelope. This picture was taken the day before Daniel disappeared. He pointed to the background. There were 4 people in that warehouse. Daniel, myself, and 2 others. The room leaned forward. But someone carefully tore the other 2 faces out of every official copy. A murmur spread through the crowd. Ethan looked closer. Richard was right. The edges of the old photograph had been deliberately cut years ago. Someone had erased part of history. Just then, the ballroom doors opened. A gray-haired woman hurried inside, breathing hard. "Richard!" Everyone turned. Richard's eyes widened. "Margaret?" She held an old metal lockbox tightly against her chest. "I heard Daniel's grandson finally came." She looked directly at Ethan. "I've been protecting this box for 40 years." The room fell completely silent. Margaret placed the lockbox on the chairman's table. It had one small keyhole. Richard slowly looked down at the brass key in his hand, then back at Ethan. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandfather knew." He knew this box and that key would one day meet again. Richard inserted the key. The lock clicked open. Inside lay a thick stack of original company documents, and one sealed envelope with Harold Collins' name written across the front. No one dared breathe. Richard stared at the sealed envelope with Harold Collins' name written across it. The ink had faded with age. The seal, however, had never been broken. Richard looked at Collins. "Have you ever seen this before?" Collins answered too quickly. "No." Richard nodded. "Interesting." He held up the envelope for everyone to see. Because Daniel wrote one sentence on the back. He slowly turned it over. In neat handwriting, everyone read, "Open this only if Harold Collins claims he is innocent." The ballroom erupted. Collins stumbled backward. That's ridiculous. You forged that." Richard calmly broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten confession. Not from Collins. From Daniel Brooks. Richard began reading. "If you're hearing these words, then Harold denied everything. Exactly as I expected. I couldn't prove who framed me, but I left enough pieces for the truth to survive me." The room became silent again. The evidence was divided into 3 places. This letter, the contents of Vault 17B, and one final witness who promised never to speak unless I was gone. Richard stopped reading. A new mystery had just replaced the old one. "There was another witness," he whispered. One shareholder stood. "Who is the witness?" Richard looked back at the letter. "It doesn't say." Instead, another line caught his attention. "The witness has lived inside this company every single day." Confused whispers spread through the ballroom. Every employee looked at everyone else. Could it be another executive? A secretary? Someone from accounting? No one knew. Richard reached into the lockbox. Beneath the documents lay the original ownership ledger from 40 years earlier. He opened it carefully. The signatures were still clear. Daniel Brooks, Richard Sterling. Then, a third signature. Richard frowned. This page has been altered. The audience leaned closer. Someone had covered another name with correction fluid decades ago, but time had begun peeling it away. Only a few letters remained visible. Call. Harold Collins suddenly lost his balance and grabbed a chair. His breathing became heavy. Richard looked directly at him. You've spent 40 years hiding one signature. Collins shook his head desperately. You don't understand. No, Richard replied quietly. I understand more every minute. Just then, Ethan noticed something inside the lockbox. There are more papers underneath. He carefully lifted the ledger. Hidden beneath it was a small cassette tape. A handwritten label covered the front. It simply read, "Play this where everyone can hear." Richard slowly picked it up. His hands trembled. Daniel hadn't just left documents. He had left his own voice. Richard looked around the silent ballroom. If this tape still works. He swallowed hard. The man we've all been searching for may identify himself before it even finishes on. The ballroom's old media player was placed on the chairman's table. Richard carefully inserted the cassette. A soft click echoed through the silent room. Then, static. For a long 3 seconds, no one heard anything. Several guests exchanged disappointed looks. Suddenly, a familiar voice filled the ballroom. Daniel Brooks. Older, weak, but unmistakably called. If this tape is playing, then I never got the chance to clear my name. Richard closed his eyes. He hadn't heard his friend's voice in 40 years. Richard, if you're listening, I'm sorry I couldn't protect what we built. The chairman's hands began to shake. I discovered that someone on our executive team was secretly selling company patents before we launched our first products. Gasps spread across the room. When I confronted him, he offered me money to stay quiet. I refused. The next morning, I became the thief. The ballroom remained frozen. Every person was listening. Every heartbeat seemed louder than before. The fake records, the missing money, the witnesses, everything had already been prepared. Richard stared directly at Harold Collins. Collins couldn't meet his eyes. Daniel's voice continued. I wanted to expose him immediately, but I realized he wasn't working alone. A ripple of tension swept through the crowd. There was more than one traitor. If only one man falls, the others will simply hide again. So I disappeared. The guests looked at one another in disbelief. Daniel hadn't run away. He had sacrificed his own name. For years, I gathered evidence. Every document, every receipt, every signature was hidden where they could never destroy everything at once. Richard slowly opened the ownership ledger again. Everything Daniel had said matched the evidence inside the lockbox. Then the recording reached its final revelation. Richard, the first man you should question. The ballroom held its breath. Is not Harold Collins. Shock rippled through the room. Harold's eyes flew open. He looked almost relieved. Then Daniel finished the sentence. Harold only followed orders. The man who planned everything. A long burst of static interrupted the tape. No, Richard whispered. The room leaned closer. The sound returned. Is sitting closer to you than your own shadow. Silence. The tape clicked. It had ended. Nobody spoke. Then, without warning, one of the senior board members quietly pushed back his chair. He smiled. Not with fear, with confidence. I suppose, he said calmly, there's no reason for me to keep pretending anymore. Every head turned toward him. Richard's face hardened. Arthur. The elderly director straightened his tie. You're finally asking the right man to... Arthur Bennett, the company's oldest board member, calmly buttoned his suit jacket. There was no panic in his face, only resignation. I wondered how long Daniel could keep this alive, he said quietly. 40 years is longer than I expected. The room erupted. You admit it? One shareholder shouted. Arthur looked around the ballroom. I admit I made a choice. Richard stepped closer. A choice? You destroyed my best friend's life. Arthur nodded once. And I saved this company. Gasps echoed through the room. Arthur spoke without raising his voice. 40 years ago, Sterling Global was collapsing. Investors were leaving. Banks refused to lend us another dollar. He looked at Richard. You wanted honesty. I wanted survival. Richard's jaw tightened. So you framed Daniel? Arthur sighed. Daniel discovered our illegal financing before the first merger. He threatened to report everything. If he had, this company would have died before it employed a single worker. The room fell silent. Arthur wasn't denying his crime. He was trying to justify it. Richard slowly shook his head. You didn't save the company. You stole it. Arthur smiled faintly. History is written by whoever survives. Richard reached into the lockbox and removed one final document. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Arthur's smile faded. Richard unfolded the paper. It was a notarized partnership agreement signed 40 years earlier. Daniel Brooks, Richard Sterling, Arthur Bennett. The signatures were original. The date was clear. So you were never just a board member, Richard said. You were our financial partner. Arthur remained silent. Richard continued. And according to this agreement, if any partner deliberately defrauded another, he automatically surrendered every ownership right. The shareholders leaned forward. Arthur's confidence disappeared. He grabbed the document. This agreement was destroyed. Richard gently took it back. No. Daniel protected the original. Richard turned toward the company's legal counsel. As chairman, I request an immediate emergency vote. The attorney nodded. On what grounds? Richard looked directly at Arthur. Fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, and the unlawful theft of a founding partner's ownership. The attorney stood. Motion accepted. Within minutes, electronic voting screens lit up across the ballroom. One by one, the votes appeared. Remove Arthur Bennett. Yes. Another. Yes. Another. Yes. The screen quickly became unanimous. Arthur looked around the room. Not a single person defended him. Richard faced Ethan. Your grandfather never wanted revenge. He wanted the truth. Then Richard addressed every shareholder. Today, Daniel Brooks is officially restored as a founding partner of Sterling Global. And because Daniel is no longer alive, Richard looked at Ethan with quiet respect. His legal ownership passes to his only surviving heir. The ballroom erupted in stunned applause. The porter everyone had mocked that morning had just become one of the company's largest shareholders. The applause slowly faded, but Ethan Brooks remained exactly where he had been standing. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He looked at the floor where security had grabbed him only an hour earlier. Richard noticed. He walked over and held out his hand. Ethan, I'm sorry. The ballroom fell silent once again. The company failed your grandfather. I failed my best friend. And today, Richard swallowed. I almost failed his grandson. Ethan looked at the chairman. My grandfather never hated you. Richard's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't have. He kept your picture beside his bed. The room grew completely still. Ethan reached into his pocket one last time. I almost forgot. He asked me to give you this only after everything was over. He handed Richard a small, worn pocket watch. Richard recognized it immediately. His hands began to tremble. 40 years earlier, he and Daniel had bought matching watches with their very first paycheck. Richard had lost his during the company's first warehouse fire. Daniel had quietly kept his own all these years. Inside the watch was a tiny folded note. Richard opened it carefully. It read, "Some friendships are worth waiting a lifetime to restore." For the first time that day, Richard couldn't hold back his tears. He embraced Ethan without saying another word. The ballroom erupted into applause once more. Not for wealth, not for power, but for truth that had survived 40 years. A week later, Sterling Global announced a complete correction of its corporate history. Every company building displayed a new bronze plaque. It read, "Founded by Richard Sterling and Daniel Brooks, whose integrity became the foundation of everything we are." The scholarship program Daniel had dreamed of was finally created. It would support the children of hotel porters, cleaners, janitors, mechanics, and every worker whose dignity was too often overlooked. Ethan accepted his inheritance. But he refused the chairman's private office. Instead, he asked for something much simpler. "I'd like to spend one more week working as a porter." The request surprised everyone. When reporters asked why, Ethan smiled. "My uniform never made me small. It only revealed who judged people by appearances." Months later, Richard often walked through the hotel lobby. Whenever he saw a porter carrying heavy luggage, he stopped to shake their hand. Because he had learned a lesson that no fortune could buy. Sometimes, the person everyone tries to throw out is the very person carrying the truth that can change everything.